The apartment on Maple Street was small, cramped, and smelled faintly of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. It wasn't much, but Jennifer Mitchell had worked hard to make it a home for her daughter. The walls were painted a soft pale yellow, the color of sunshine on a cloudy day. Posters of Disney princesses decorated Sarah's bedroom, and a worn teddy bear sat proudly on the little girl's pillow. Jennifer had scrubbed these floors on her hands and knees, hung these curtains herself, and filled this space with all the love a single mother could muster. It was here, in this humble apartment, that everything fell apart on a cold February evening. The trouble had started 3 months earlier when Jennifer met at the grocery store where she worked. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in her life. After years of loneliness, raising Sarah alone while working double shifts as a nurse, Jennifer was desperate for companionship. Told her she was beautiful. He told her she was strong. He told her that he and Sarah could be a real family. At first, it seemed like a dream. He would bring gifts for Sarah, coloring books and small toys. He'd offer to watch Sarah while Jennifer took a rare evening off. He seemed perfect. But perfection was a mask. The first warning sign came on a Tuesday night when Sarah accidentally spilled juice on his shirt. His entire demeanor shifted, his jaw clenched, his eyes darkened. He didn't say much, just an icy, "Kids should learn better." But Jennifer felt the shift in the air, a sudden coldness that hadn't been there before. She told herself it was nothing. Everyone had bad days. Everyone got frustrated. The second warning sign was harder to ignore. Began making comments about Jennifer's appearance. "You'd look prettier if you wore your hair down. That shirt makes you look fat. Why are you always so tired? It's unattractive." Jennifer would bristle, but he'd laugh it off, saying he was just teasing, that she needed to develop thicker skin. Slowly, imperceptibly, she began changing herself, not for her, but for him. She wore her hair the way he preferred. She chose clothes he approved of. She scheduled her work shifts around his free time. She was sinking, drowning in a relationship that was tightening around her throat like invisible hands. By February, had moved into the apartment. He insisted on it, said that's what real couples did, what real families looked like. Jennifer's friends had warned her. Her sister had called repeatedly, begging her to be careful. But Jennifer convinced herself that everyone was wrong, that just needed time to adjust, that love required patience and compromise. That terrible Tuesday evening had started innocently enough. Sarah was playing with her dolls in the living room while Jennifer prepared dinner, his favorite, pasta with garlic bread. Sarah was 3 years old, with strawberry curls and wide green eyes that reflected her mother's gentle nature. She was a quiet, observant child who had learned early in her young life to read the moods of the adults around her. Came home from work around 5:47 p.m. Jennifer remembered checking the clock when she heard his truck pull into the parking lot. He didn't come in through the front door as usual. Instead, he went directly to the kitchen where Jennifer was standing. He seemed agitated, his shoulders tense, his jaw working as if he was chewing on something bitter. "Hey, babe," Jennifer said, trying to brighten the mood. "I made your favorite. Sarah's been so good today. We went to the park and—" "I don't want to hear about the park," interrupted, his voice sharp as broken glass. "I want to know why my boss called me today saying he saw you at the shopping mall with another man." Jennifer's stomach dropped. The shopping mall. She had gone to the mall that afternoon with her sister. They'd grabbed coffee and walked around for an hour. It had been innocent, meaningless, just two sisters enjoying time together. "That was my sister. We just got coffee and—" "I don't care if it was the Pope himself." His voice rose, filling the small apartment. "You had no business being anywhere without telling me first. Do you understand what that makes you look like? Do you understand how stupid that makes me look?" "It wasn't anything, I was just—" He grabbed her wrist suddenly, his fingers digging into her skin hard enough to leave marks. "You don't go anywhere without permission. You don't talk to anyone without permission. Is that clear?" Jennifer tried to pull away, but his grip was iron. "You're hurting me. Let go." Sarah heard the commotion and came running from the living room. "Mommy," she called out, her small voice trembling with fear. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Released Jennifer with a shove that sent her stumbling backward. She crashed against the kitchen counter, pain shooting through her hip. Before she could steady herself, advanced on her again, his face twisted with rage. His hand came up, and he struck her across the face with an open palm. The impact was shocking, explosive, like a gunshot in the confined space. Jennifer fell to her knees. Her lip was bleeding. Her face burned with pain and humiliation, and through the blur of tears and shock, she heard her daughter screaming. "Mommy, Mommy!" Sarah's screams were primal, desperate, the sound of a child watching her world collapse. The little girl ran toward them, her arms outstretched. "Stop! Stop! Don't hurt Mommy!" Grabbed Sarah roughly. "Shut up, both of you, shut up!" "Don't you touch her!" Jennifer cried out, adrenaline surging through her veins. She lunged trying to reach for her daughter, but he was bigger, stronger, more practiced at violence. He threw Jennifer backward again, and this time she landed hard on the floor, gasping for breath. Sarah's screams continued, high-pitched and terrified. The little girl watched as her mother struggled, watched as the man she'd been taught to call Daddy towered over her mother with his fists clenched. Sarah was crying so hard she could barely breathe. "You want more," snarled at Jennifer. "You want me to show you what happens when you disrespect me." But then sirens, distant at first, then growing louder, wailing through the Cleveland night. A neighbor had called 911. The sound of those sirens seemed to penetrate rage-filled haze. His eyes widened. For a moment he stood frozen, considering his options. Then he ran. He bolted toward the bedroom, through the apartment, and out the back door, disappearing into the darkness like a ghost. Jennifer, her face bleeding and swollen, immediately pulled Sarah into her arms. The little girl was shaking, sobbing uncontrollably, her tiny body heaving with the trauma of what she'd witnessed. Jennifer held her close, whispering assurances that everything would be okay, that Mommy was there, that they were safe. But she knew, even as she said the words, that nothing would ever be the same. When the police arrived 3 minutes later, they found a woman and a child broken on the kitchen floor. The official report would later describe Jennifer as the aggressor. No one listened to what Sarah's terrified eyes had seen. No one asked the little girl what really happened. The system, broken and flawed, would fail them both. The county police department received the 911 call at 6:04 p.m. on that cold February evening. Officer David Martinez and his partner Officer Susan arrived at the modest apartment building on Maple Street within minutes, their sirens cutting through the quiet suburban neighborhood. What they found was a woman with a bleeding lip and a terrified 3-year-old child. What they didn't find was the man responsible. Officer Martinez took one look at the scene, a woman covered in her own blood, an overturned chair, broken glass on the kitchen floor, and made an instantaneous judgment. The bruises on Jennifer's face were prominent, visible, undeniable. But in his 14 years on the force, Martinez had developed a particular bias. He believed that women called domestic violence reports as revenge tactics, as ways to manipulate custody situations. He had seen it happen before, or thought he had. This bias would become the foundation upon which an entire false narrative would be constructed. "Ma'am, I need you to come with us," Officer said to Jennifer, her hand resting on her handcuffs. Jennifer tried to explain, tried to tell them about his explosive rage, about how he'd run out the back door. But the officers seemed uninterested in her version of events. They were focused on the physical evidence, and the physical evidence appeared to show a woman who had been in a violent altercation. Sarah clung to her mother, screaming. The little girl didn't understand what was happening, only that Mommy was being taken away by strangers in uniforms. Jennifer's protests grew more desperate as she was led to the patrol car, her arms reaching backward toward her daughter. "Please, my baby, please don't take me away from my baby. I didn't do anything, please." The neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, watching in stunned silence. Nobody stepped forward to corroborate Jennifer's story. Nobody knew exactly what had happened, and the police, it seemed, weren't interested in investigation. They were interested in closure, in filing a report and moving on to the next call. Sarah was placed in temporary protective custody. A representative from the Department of Children and Family Services, an exhausted woman named Carol who had been working for 16 hours straight, completed the paperwork. Sarah was driven to a foster home run by a kind but overworked elderly couple named Ruth and Holmes. Ruth did her best to comfort the traumatized child, but nothing could replace her mother's arms, her mother's voice, her mother's love. At the county courthouse, Judge Harold sat in his chambers reviewing case files late into the evening. 23 years on the bench had taught him to trust his instincts, and his instincts were screaming that something was wrong with the Mitchell case. He'd been assigned the matter because of his reputation for thoroughness, for refusing to accept cases at face value. Judge was 58 years old, with silver threading through his black hair and deep lines around his eyes, the marks of a man who had seen too much injustice and worked too hard to correct it. He pulled the police report from the file and began reading it carefully, line by line. Officer Martinez had written, "Upon arrival at scene, found female subject with visible injuries consistent with aggressive behavior. Subject admitted to altercation with live-in partner. No corroborating witnesses. Subject became combative when questioned. Male subject had left premises. Female subject arrested for domestic assault." That was it. That was the entire investigation. No mention of, no attempt to locate him, no interviews with neighbors, no investigation into his background, no consideration of the child's safety or what she might have witnessed. Judge made a note in his file. Investigation appears incomplete. Recommend thorough review before proceeding. He ordered a more comprehensive evaluation of the case, including interviews with the neighbors, examination of the apartment for additional evidence, and a background check on. What the investigation revealed made Judge's blood run cold. Had a criminal record, 3 domestic violence arrests in 3 different states over the previous 8 years. He'd served 18 months in prison for assault. There were 2 active restraining orders against him from previous relationships. One woman had reported that he'd choked her. Another said he'd threatened to take her children if she ever left him. He was a predator, a serial abuser who moved from victim to victim, leaving destruction in his wake. Yet Officer Martinez's report had made no mention of any of this. It was as if it didn't exist in the official narrative, as if the investigation had simply stopped after finding Jennifer bleeding on her kitchen floor. Meanwhile, Jennifer sat in the county jail, unable to post bail. Her public defender was overwhelmed with cases. She had 187 active files on her desk and was working 60-hour weeks just to keep her head above water. The attorney, a well-meaning but exhausted woman named Torres, managed only a brief consultation with Jennifer before her first appearance hearing. "I didn't do this," Jennifer told her desperately. "Did this, he hit me, he grabbed Sarah, he—" "I know, I believe you," said, but her eyes were distant, distracted. She had heard similar stories dozens of times. Some were true and some weren't. She had no time to investigate, no resources to do so. "We'll figure this out, but first we need to address bail." The bail hearing was perfunctory. The prosecutor argued that Jennifer was a flight risk and a danger to her daughter. Jennifer sat in an orange jail jumpsuit, trying to maintain her composure, trying to convince a judge who had never seen her before that she was innocent. She was bail and remanded back into custody. In the foster home, Sarah had stopped eating. She sat on the bed in Ruth's spare bedroom, staring at nothing, barely responding when spoken to. She would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, her small body drenched in sweat. She asked for her mommy constantly, a heartbreaking, repetitive refrain that broke Ruth's heart but that she felt powerless to address. The social workers who evaluated the case were sympathetic but bound by the system. The police report said Jennifer was the aggressor. The court said Sarah was in danger at home. Therefore, Sarah had to remain in foster care. The fact that the investigation was flawed, that the truth had been buried, that an innocent woman was rotting in jail, these were systemic failures that no single person seemed empowered to correct. Judge, however, was not willing to let it go. He ordered a more comprehensive hearing, a chance for a thorough examination of the evidence. He called in his own investigator, a former detective named Maria Santos, with specific instructions: find out what really happened on Maple Street on that February evening. Maria began her work with grim determination. She interviewed neighbors who confirmed seeing a man matching his description fleeing the building. She examined photographs of the apartment that revealed defensive wounds on Jennifer's arms, marks consistent with someone trying to protect themselves from an attacker. She located his ex-girlfriend in Pittsburgh, who came forward with her own story of abuse and fear. The pieces of the true story began to fall into place, like a puzzle that had been assembled backward, revealing now a completely different picture than the one Officer Martinez had so carelessly constructed. But none of this mattered yet. Jennifer remained in jail. Sarah remained in foster care, and the broken system ground on, indifferent to the truth, indifferent to the devastation it was causing to an innocent mother and a traumatized child. Judge scheduled a new hearing. He would not rest until justice was served. But time was running out, and Sarah was deteriorating. Something dramatic would need to happen, something extraordinary, to break through the bureaucratic barriers and save this family from the system that was supposed to protect them. Judge Harold sat across from Detective Maria Santos in a quiet conference room at the courthouse, surrounded by case files and evidence photographs. The walls were a sterile beige, and the overhead fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the table. Between them sat a folder marked Mitchell Case Additional Investigation, and inside were the documented truths that Officer Martinez's negligent report had overlooked. But they had a problem, a serious one that kept Judge awake at night. "She won't talk," Maria said bluntly, her weathered face reflecting the weight of what she'd uncovered. "Sarah has shut down completely. The therapist says she's traumatized, possibly regressing. Every time anyone tries to question her formally, she freezes. She won't make eye contact. She barely speaks." Judge rubbed his temples. "We have all the evidence we need. History, the neighbors' testimonies, the defensive wounds on Jennifer's arms." "We do," Maria interrupted, "but it's not enough. Sarah is the only witness who actually saw what happened that night. Her testimony could nail this case shut, could prove without a shadow of a doubt that Jennifer is innocent and is guilty. Without it, we have a strong circumstantial case, but a good prosecutor could still argue that we don't have definitive proof of what occurred behind closed doors." The situation was frustrating and heartbreaking in equal measure. They had uncovered the truth, but the very victim of trauma, the 3-year-old girl who had witnessed the violence, was too psychologically damaged to articulate what she knew. Her mind had essentially locked away the memories as a protective mechanism. Judge leaned back in his chair, thinking. He'd been in this profession long enough to know that conventional approaches didn't always work. Sometimes you had to think outside the box, had to find creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems. An idea began forming in his mind, a strategy so unconventional that his peers might question his judgment, but one that could potentially unlock the truth that Sarah's trauma had buried. "What about the K-9 unit?" he asked suddenly. "Wasn't there a program being piloted for support dogs in the courthouse?" Maria's eyes lit up with understanding. "Duke," she said. "The German Shepherd. I've heard about that program. He's trained specifically for emotional support in sensitive cases involving children, but I've never seen it actually used before." Judge stood and began packing. "Get me information on the dog handler, on Duke's training, on whether this could even be legally permissible. This is unconventional, but it might be exactly what we need." 3 days later, Judge sat down with Officer Tom Bradley, a 15-year veteran of the Cleveland Police Department's K-9 unit. Tom had dedicated the last 5 years to training Duke specifically for trauma victims. Duke was a magnificent German shepherd, 3 years old, with a coat the color of burnished mahogany and brown eyes that seemed to contain infinite compassion. "Duke's different," Officer Bradley explained, his voice carrying the pride of a handler who had worked with the animal since puppyhood. "Most K-9 units are trained for detection or protection. Duke is trained for emotional support. He can sense when a child is anxious or afraid. He responds by staying calm, by providing a physical presence that communicates safety. In studies, the presence of a support dog has been shown to reduce cortisol levels, the stress hormone, in traumatized children by up to 40%. "Has he ever in court before?" Judge asked. "Not exactly," Tom replied. "But he's been present during interviews with traumatized children. The results have been remarkable. Kids who were previously non-responsive have opened up. They've shared information they couldn't access before. It's not about the dog extracting information. It's about the dog creating an environment where a child feels safe enough to communicate." Judge nodded slowly. "This could work. This could actually work." "I want to try something," he said to Tom. "I want Duke to meet the girl before any formal questioning. I want her to become comfortable with him, to develop a rapport with him. Then, when she enters the courtroom for her statement, Duke will be there as a familiar, comforting presence." Officer Bradley's eyes widened. "You're talking about using Duke in actual court proceedings?" "I am," Judge confirmed. "Is that possible?" Tom considered the question carefully. "Legally, I'm not sure. This would be precedent-setting, but I believe it's possible and I believe it could help. The girl, Sarah, she needs to feel safe. She needs to understand that she's not in trouble, that telling the truth is okay. Duke can communicate that in a way no words can." The next morning, Maria Santos accompanied Officer Bradley and Duke to Ruth and Holmes's foster home. Ruth had been briefed on the situation and had given her permission for Sarah to interact with the dog. The elderly woman sat nervously in the living room, watching as Tom approached Sarah with Duke on a loose leash. Sarah was sitting on the floor, staring at nothing, a tiny figure lost in her own traumatic world. She didn't notice Duke at first. The dog moved slowly, deliberately, with the careful grace of an animal trained in compassion. Tom allowed Duke to approach Sarah at his own pace without forcing interaction. Duke stopped about 3 feet away from the little girl. He sat down, his massive body settling onto the carpet. He didn't approach further. He didn't try to touch her. He simply existed in her space, a calm, gentle presence. Sarah's head turned slightly. Her green eyes, which had been so bright and full of life just weeks ago, lifted toward the dog. For several minutes, nothing happened. Sarah stared at Duke, and Duke stared back, his expression serene and patient. Then, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, Sarah moved. She extended one small hand forward, not quite reaching the dog, but expressing interest. Tom remained still, letting Duke read Sarah's cues. Duke responded by gently moving forward, his head lowering to allow Sarah to touch him. Her tiny fingers made contact with his fur, and something shifted. The little girl's shoulders, which had been hunched and tense, relaxed slightly. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, seemed to deepen. "Hi, Duke," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. It was the first time she'd spoken voluntarily in over a week. Maria Santos, watching from across the room, felt tears streaming down her face. She'd seen this girl's chart, had reviewed the devastating psychological assessments. She'd wondered if Sarah would ever truly recover from what she'd witnessed. But here, in this simple moment, a 3-year-old girl was communicating again, reaching out to another living being, creating a connection. For the next hour, Sarah and Duke existed together in their own world. She petted his fur. She laid her head against his side. Duke remained perfectly still, offering his calm presence like a gift. When Officer Bradley eventually indicated it was time to go, Sarah clung to the dog's fur. "Will Duke come back?" she asked Tom. Yes, Tom said gently. Duke will be there when you go to the big building with all the people. Duke will be right there with you. Over the next week, Tom brought Duke for 3 more visits. Each time, Sarah became more animated, more present, more connected to reality. She began asking questions about Duke. She asked about his favorite foods, about where he slept, about whether he liked her. On the night before the scheduled hearing, Judge reviewed the video recordings of Sarah's interactions with Duke. The transformation was remarkable. The child who had been catatonic was now engaged. The girl who hadn't spoken was now asking questions. The victim who seemed lost was now reaching out. Judge made a decision. He would file an emergency motion allowing Duke to be present during Sarah's testimony. He would argue that the dog's presence was not about entertainment or spectacle, but about creating the psychological conditions necessary for a traumatized child to communicate truthfully. He would argue that justice itself depended on Sarah feeling safe enough to speak. The next morning, as Sarah was driven to the courthouse by Ruth Holmes, the little girl kept asking, "Will Duke be there? Will Duke help me?" "Yes," Ruth promised, "Duke will be there." She didn't know that Judge had fought through the night, preparing legal arguments for why a police dog should be allowed in a courtroom. She didn't know that prosecutors were preparing counterarguments, that tradition was being challenged, that the entire foundation of courtroom procedure might be about to shift. All she knew was that a little girl who had been broken was about to have the chance to be heard, and that a remarkable dog was going to help make that possible. The county courthouse was packed on the morning of March 15th. News had leaked that a police support dog would be present in the proceedings, and journalists had descended on the building like vultures. Judge had granted limited press access, aware that public scrutiny might actually benefit the case. It would ensure transparency, ensure that no one could claim the proceedings were improper or inadequately documented. Sarah sat in a small preparation room off the main courtroom, wearing a pale pink dress that Ruth Holmes had carefully selected. The elderly woman sat beside her, holding her small hand. Sarah was visibly anxious, her leg bouncing up and down, her thumb finding its way to her mouth, a regressive behavior that appeared whenever she was stressed. "Is Duke here?" Sarah asked for perhaps the 100th time. "Duke is waiting for you in the big room," Ruth assured her. "He'll be right there, okay? Right there where you can see him." Officer Tom Bradley stood in the hallway with Duke, doing final preparations. He'd groomed the dog meticulously, ensuring Duke looked noble and calm. He'd spent the morning reviewing the rules established by Judge. Duke would be present, but on a designated mat in the courtroom. The dog would not approach the witness stand. Sarah could acknowledge Duke's presence, but there would be no physical interaction during testimony. It was a delicate balance between therapeutic benefit and courtroom propriety. In the main courtroom, the energy was electric and tense. Judge Harold sat elevated on the bench, his silver hair catching the morning light. To the left sat the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Richard, a seasoned veteran with a reputation for aggressive questioning. Jennifer Mitchell's new attorney, a competent and well-prepared lawyer named James, sat at the defense table. Jennifer herself sat nearby, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes red from sleepless nights in jail. Wasn't present. He remained a fugitive, though federal authorities had joined the manhunt and a nationwide alert had been issued. His absence was conspicuous, damning, a tacit admission of guilt that spoke louder than any alibi could have. The courtroom doors opened, and Officer Bradley walked in, Duke's leash in hand. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. The dog was magnificent and commanding, yet his demeanor was calm and peaceful. He moved with deliberate grace, his dark eyes surveying the courtroom with what almost seemed like understanding. Duke was led to a specially prepared mat in a corner of the courtroom, positioned so that Sarah could see him clearly from the witness stand. The dog settled onto the mat with practiced ease, his head resting on his front paws, his eyes alert and focused. Then Sarah entered. The little girl looked impossibly small as she walked toward the witness stand. Her pink dress seemed to make her appear even more fragile, more vulnerable. She was pale, her eyes wide with fear. But as soon as she saw Duke, something shifted in her body. Her shoulders relaxed infinitesimally. Her breathing steadied. She allowed the bailiff to help her into the witness stand, where she sat on a booster seat that had been specially arranged so her face would be visible to the judge and the attorneys. Judge leaned forward slightly. His voice, when he spoke, was remarkably gentle for a man of law. "Hello, Sarah. My name is Judge. I'm going to ask you some questions today, okay? And I want you to know that Duke is right there." He gestured toward the dog. "If you get scared or upset, you just look at Duke, okay? Duke is here to help you feel safe." Sarah nodded mutely, her green eyes fixed on the dog. The initial questions were simple, foundational. What was your name? How old are you? Who do you live with? Where does your mommy work? Sarah answered in a small, barely audible voice, but she answered. With each question, her confidence seemed to grow. She was still frightened, but she was no longer paralyzed. Then James stood to conduct his questioning. He was careful, deliberate, trauma-informed in his approach. "Sarah, I want to ask you about the day the police came to your house. Do you remember that day?" Sarah's eyes shifted briefly toward her mother, then back to Judge. She nodded. "Can you tell me what happened that day? What do you remember?" There was a long pause. Sarah's hands gripped the sides of the booster seat. Her lip trembled. This was the moment where many children would shut down, would regress back into silence and trauma. But Sarah glanced at Duke, and something passed between the girl and the dog. An invisible current of reassurance, of safety, of permission to speak truth. "He was mean," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who was mean, sweetie?" asked gently. "The bad man." "Can you tell me more about the bad man? What did he do?" Sarah's eyes drifted to the left, toward the empty chair where should have been sitting, where the man who had terrorized her had been seated so many times before. But he wasn't there. And in that moment, looking around the courtroom, Sarah seemed to make a connection. There was a man missing. There was an absence where violence used to be. Her small hand lifted and pointed, but she wasn't pointing at the empty chair where it sat. She was pointing at Duke. "Bad man," she said, her voice suddenly clearer, more certain. "Bad man." The courtroom fell completely silent. An entire room full of experienced attorneys, judges, journalists, and observers seemed to freeze simultaneously. This wasn't what they'd anticipated. This wasn't a direct accusation. Sarah had pointed at Duke and called him a bad man. For a moment, confusion reigned. Had the strategy backfired? Had Sarah somehow become confused or frightened of Duke? Had the therapeutic approach inadvertently traumatized her further? But Judge's eyes narrowed with understanding. He'd spent 23 years reading human behavior, understanding the subtle ways that trauma victims communicated. He understood that a 3-year-old girl, asked to identify a bad man, had just made a profound psychological association. She was saying that Duke represented the bad man, or more accurately, that Duke, as a symbol of authority and safety and presence, was connected to what she needed to communicate about the bad man in her life. In her fragmented, traumatized 3-year-old mind, Sarah was using the dog as a proxy, a way to access memories and truths that she couldn't articulate directly. "Sarah," Judge said carefully, "when you say bad man, do you mean that there was a bad man at your house? A bad man who was not your mommy?" Sarah's eyes, which had drifted away, snapped back to attention. She looked at the judge, then back at Duke, then at her mother. She nodded vigorously. "Yes," she said, her voice gaining strength. Bad man hurt mommy." The prosecutor stood, objecting, questioning the validity of the testimony, arguing that a 3-year-old couldn't reliably communicate about complex events. But Judge overruled him, his face set with determination. "Describe what the bad man did," James said. "Can you show me with your hands? Can you make the movements?" What Sarah did next would be replayed on the news that evening and discussed in legal circles for months to come. She stood on the booster seat. The bailiff allowed it, understanding that she needed to communicate physically, and she mimicked the movements of someone throwing punches. She made hitting motions. She demonstrated how had grabbed her mother's arm. She recreated, in her innocent child's way, the violence she'd witnessed. And through it all, her eyes kept drifting back to Duke. The dog remained perfectly still on his mat, a silent witness and silent supporter of the truth being revealed. By the time Sarah finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. The prosecutor made a half-hearted attempt to cross-examine her, but it was clear that his case was crumbling. A 3-year-old girl, who should have been too traumatized to communicate, had just provided testimony that corroborated every piece of physical evidence that Detective Maria Santos had uncovered. Judge called for a recess. As Sarah was led from the witness stand, she looked back one final time at Duke. The dog's tail wagged slightly, a small acknowledgement of a job well done. Officer Bradley leaned down and whispered, "Good boy, Duke. Very good boy." The dog had helped unlock the truth that an entire system had tried to bury. The recess in the courtroom lasted exactly 40 minutes. In that time, everything changed. Judge Harold, aware that he had just witnessed testimony that contradicted the original police report, made a series of phone calls that would set the entire investigative apparatus in motion. By the time Sarah's testimony ended, federal authorities had already been contacted. The United States Marshals Service, responsible for tracking fugitives across state lines, had opened a file on. The FBI, concerned about domestic violence cases that cross state boundaries, had indicated their willingness to assist. Detective Maria Santos didn't wait for formal authorization. She was already at her desk when the judge's call came through, and she was already pulling a complete criminal file. What emerged was a portrait of a man who had perfected the art of violence and evasion. In Virginia, 7 years prior, had been arrested for assault against a woman named Summers. He'd served 14 months. Upon release, he'd relocated to North Carolina, where he'd assaulted another woman, a nurse named Torres, and fled before charges could be filed. In Pennsylvania, he'd been involved in a domestic violence incident that resulted in his arrest, but the victim had recanted her testimony, terrified of his threats. Then Ohio, then Cleveland, then Jennifer Mitchell. The pattern was unmistakable, a predatory trajectory spanning multiple states, multiple victims, multiple narrow escapes. Was a specialist in destruction. He destroyed women's lives, their confidence, their bodies, their futures. And then he disappeared like smoke, leaving behind only trauma and legal confusion. "He's organized," Maria said grimly to Judge over the phone. "This isn't random violence. This is systematic abuse. He knows how to work the system. He knows how to intimidate victims into silence. He knows how to disappear when authorities close in." "Then we need to make it impossible for him to disappear this time," Judge replied. "I want every resource available dedicated to finding him. I want his photograph distributed to law enforcement across the country. I want his known associates questioned. I want his financial records subpoenaed. I want to know everywhere he could possibly hide." Maria hung up the phone and began making calls. Within 2 hours, his photograph had been entered into the National Crime Information Center database. His name was added to the FBI's most wanted list for interstate flight and domestic violence with child endangerment. His social security number was flagged in multiple law enforcement systems. If he tried to open a bank account, rent an apartment, buy a plane ticket, or access any government service, alarms would sound. But the investigation wasn't just about finding. It was also about deconstructing the false narrative that Officer David Martinez had constructed. Maria obtained the original evidence from the apartment on Maple Street: photographs, clothing, forensic samples. She brought these materials to Dr., a forensic psychologist and trauma specialist who had evaluated Sarah. "Look at these bruises on Jennifer's forearms," Maria said, laying out photographs on Doctor's desk. Look at the pattern. These are defensive wounds. Someone threw punches at her, and she instinctively raised her arms to protect herself. That's the physiological response of someone being attacked, not someone committing violence. Doctor examined the photographs through a magnifying glass. These are consistent with someone defending against repeated blows. The bruising pattern suggests forceful impact, multiple strikes. And look here, she pointed to marks on Jennifer's shoulder. These look like grab marks. Someone held her down. The forensic evidence told a story completely different from Officer Martinez's report. Jennifer wasn't the aggressor. She was the victim. She was the one who had been attacked, who had defended herself, who had tried to protect her child. Meanwhile, the video evidence from the building's security system was being analyzed by a specialist named Robert, no relation to the judge. The original police report had mentioned that no security footage existed, but a more thorough investigation had located a camera positioned at the building's rear exit, the exit through which had fled. The video showed, clear as day, a man matching description exiting through the rear door at 6:01 p.m., just minutes before police arrived. He moved quickly, deliberately, casting a glance backward before disappearing into the darkness. The timestamp and the image were incontrovertible proof that the man in the apartment had fled, which meant he was guilty, which meant Jennifer was innocent. Federal investigators traced movements. Credit card records showed a purchase at a gas station in Pennsylvania 2 hours after the incident. A motel manager in Pittsburgh identified a man matching description who'd checked in using a false name. Surveillance cameras at the motel captured him entering a room, but had learned to move like water. The moment investigators got close, he vanished again. He paid for everything in cash after Pittsburgh. He didn't use his real name. He didn't contact anyone who could be traced. He was running, and he was running hard. "He knows we're coming for him," Detective Santos said to the team assembled in the federal building's conference room. "He's heard about Sarah's testimony. He knows the case against him is now airtight. He's frightened, which makes him dangerous but also makes him careless." The investigation expanded to include known associates. A woman named, who had dated him in North Carolina, came forward with information about his habits, his fears, his likely destinations. She revealed that he had a brother in Michigan and that the two had maintained sporadic contact despite their troubled relationship. Investigators staked out the brother's house. They waited. Days passed. Then, on the 8th day, a figure matching description was spotted approaching the house at midnight. Surveillance teams moved in quietly, carefully, aware that a desperate fugitive was often the most dangerous kind. When confronted, attempted to flee on foot. He made it 3 blocks before federal agents tackled him to the ground. He was handcuffed, read his rights, and placed in custody. In the interrogation room, sat across from Detective Maria Santos, his face defiant despite his obvious fear. He had lawyered up immediately, refusing to speak without counsel present, but he couldn't avoid seeing the evidence that was slowly being compiled against him. He couldn't avoid knowing that Sarah's testimony had destroyed the false narrative he'd attempted to construct. Back in Ohio, Jennifer Mitchell remained in jail, but the atmosphere had shifted. Judge had ordered an expedited hearing. The prosecutor's office was already preparing to drop charges, aware that their case was not just weak but actively undermined by new evidence. Journalists who had initially focused on sensationalism were now investigating Officer Martinez's conduct, raising questions about his investigation methods and whether he'd received inadequate training or suffered from problematic bias. The bureaucratic machinery that had once crushed an innocent woman was now being forced, reluctantly, to reverse course. And it was all because a 3-year-old girl had found her voice, and a trained police dog had made that possible. The interrogation room at the federal building in Cleveland was designed to feel inescapable. Concrete walls painted institutional gray. A single metal table bolted to the floor, 2 metal chairs. A mirror that everyone knew was one-way glass. sat on one side of the table, his wrists still bearing the red marks from the handcuffs that had been removed just minutes earlier. Across from him sat Detective Maria Santos, and beside her sat Assistant U.S. Attorney, no relation to the judge but possessed of the same incisive, penetrating intelligence. Attorney, a public defender named Robert Williams, sat beside his client. The lawyer had advised his client to remain silent, but was already cracking. The bravado he'd maintained during arrest had evaporated the moment he'd learned that federal surveillance had captured him fleeing Jennifer's apartment building on video. The moment he'd learned that Sarah had in court. The moment he'd understood that his carefully constructed escape plan had already been dismantled before he'd even left Ohio. "Your brother gave you up," Detective Santos said matter-of-factly, not unkindly. "Gave you up. Your credit card records give you up. The video footage gives you up. The forensic evidence gives you up. A 3-year-old girl gave you up." She paused, letting that sink in. "There is no version of this story where you're not guilty, not anymore." His jaw clenched. His eyes, which had been hardened and cold when he'd entered the room, began to show cracks, fissures in the facade of control that had sustained him through years of predatory behavior. "I want to know something," Maria continued. "I want to know what you thought would happen. Did you really believe you'd get away with this? Did you really think that beating a woman in front of her child would just disappear? Did you think the system would protect you?" "I want to talk to my client alone," Robert Williams interjected, placing a hand on his arm. "No," said suddenly, his voice rough. He looked at his attorney with an expression that could only be described as defeated. "No, I'm done. I'm done running. I'm done lying." Robert Williams tried to protest, but waved him off. The attorney leaned back in his chair, his professional duty completed. Whatever his client said now would be of his own volition. For the next 3 hours confessed, not to a reduced version of events, not to a partial truth designed to minimize his culpability, but to the full, unvarnished horror of what he'd done. He explained how he'd begun dating Jennifer, how he'd deliberately isolated her from friends and family, how he'd used controlling behavior to establish dominance. He explained that he'd orchestrated the confrontation over the shopping mall visit specifically because he wanted a reason to be violent. He'd been escalating the abuse for weeks, and he needed a catalyst. "I didn't plan it," he said, his voice hollow, "but I wanted it. I wanted the excuse." He described hitting Jennifer. He described grabbing her. He described the moment he'd heard the police sirens and realized he had to leave. And then, with a coldness that made everyone in the room feel sick, he described his plan. "I thought if I disappeared, if she was the one found at the scene, she'd get blamed," said. "I'd done it before in North Carolina. I'd hit that girl and made sure someone saw her hitting me back. Her word against mine. Except this time I had Sarah as a witness, which I figured worked in my favor. A kid that young wouldn't remember clearly, or she'd be too traumatized to testify. I could come back later once things died down, once Jennifer was in the system, and I could use the kid against her. I could get custody through a custody battle that was rigged in my favor, because she'd have a record." The strategy was diabolical and coldly calculated. It was also predicated on a system that would fail to investigate properly, that would accept the surface narrative, that would allow a victim to be destroyed while a predator walked free. "I didn't expect the dog," said suddenly. "I didn't expect some judge to be smart enough to figure out what actually happened. I thought I was untouchable." Detective Santos recorded every word. By the time finished his confession, he'd admitted to multiple instances of domestic violence, child endangerment, interstate flight, and attempting to evade law enforcement. He'd incriminated himself so thoroughly that there would be no defense, no legal argument, no hope of anything other than substantial incarceration. 48 hours later, Judge Harold reconvened the court. The galleries were again packed with journalists, observers, and interested parties. This time, Jennifer Mitchell stood at the defense table, not because she was on trial, but because her conviction was about to be erased from the record. Assistant District Attorney Richard stood before the judge with visible discomfort. His case, the case that he'd prosecuted with confidence just weeks ago, had been revealed as fundamentally flawed. Not just flawed, but actively unjust. "Your Honor," said, his voice controlled but clearly pained, "the state moves to dismiss all charges against Jennifer Mitchell. New evidence has come to light, evidence that was not adequately investigated during the initial police inquiry, that conclusively demonstrates that Ms. Mitchell is not guilty of the charges filed against her. Furthermore, the state's investigation has revealed that Ms. Mitchell was in fact the victim of domestic violence, not the perpetrator." Judge nodded slowly. "The charges are dismissed. All charges are dismissed. Ms. Mitchell, you are hereby declared not guilty. Your record will be expunged. You are free to go." Jennifer Mitchell collapsed to her knees. James, her attorney, helped her to her feet. She was crying, not tears of sadness, but tears of release, of the crushing weight being lifted from her shoulders. She looked toward the gallery, where Ruth Holmes was sitting, and the elderly woman was crying too. But Judge wasn't finished. He called Officer David Martinez to the stand, not as a witness, but as a subject of judicial scrutiny. "Officer Martinez," Judge said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "your investigation into this matter was grossly inadequate. You failed to follow basic investigative protocols. You failed to interview all available witnesses. You failed to conduct a thorough background check on the suspected perpetrator. You made assumptions based on appearance rather than evidence. Do you have any explanation for this dereliction of duty?" Officer Martinez sat rigid in the witness box, his face flushed with shame and anger. He said nothing. "This court is recommending a full internal affairs investigation into your conduct," Judge continued. "Furthermore, I am recommending that the police department implement mandatory training on domestic violence investigation procedures, victim trauma responses, and implicit bias awareness. This case should never have reached the state it did. This injustice should never have been allowed to occur." Judge then addressed the gallery, and the journalists he knew would carry his words to the world. "This case represents a systemic failure," he said solemnly. "An innocent woman was arrested. A traumatized child was removed from her mother. A predator was allowed to flee. All of this occurred because one police officer failed to do his job properly. All of this was reversed because one 3-year-old girl found the courage to tell her truth, and because one trained support animal created an environment where that truth could be spoken." He paused, looking directly at Detective Maria Santos, at Judge's name appearing in records, at Officer Tom Bradley, who was sitting in the gallery with Duke. "This court commends Detective Santos for her thorough. This court commends Judge for his commitment to justice. This court commends Officer Tom Bradley and the K-9 unit for demonstrating innovative approaches to trauma-informed courtroom procedures. And this court acknowledges the remarkable courage of a 3-year-old victim who refused to be silenced." The courtroom erupted. Journalists rushed toward the exits, eager to file their stories. Jennifer Mitchell was embraced by her attorney, by Ruth Holmes, by sympathetic observers who understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. Would face trial on federal charges. He would receive a sentence of 18 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 12. He would spend the rest of his life labeled as a predator, registered as a domestic violence offender, forever marked by the system he'd tried to manipulate. But none of that mattered to Jennifer. She was free. Her daughter would be returned to her. Their nightmare was ending. The settlement agreement arrived on a Tuesday morning in April, 6 weeks after his confession. Jennifer Mitchell sat in the office of her civil attorney, staring at the number written on the official document with a sense of unreality. $2 million. The state of Ohio, admitting liability for the wrongful arrest, wrongful incarceration, and wrongful removal of her child, was prepared to pay $2 million. "This isn't just about money," explained gently. "This is about accountability. This is the system acknowledging that it failed you, that it caused you harm, and that it bears responsibility for that harm. Jennifer read through the document, line by line. There were specific mentions of Officer Martinez's negligent investigation. There were references to systemic failures in the police department's training protocols. There was acknowledgement of the trauma caused to both her and her daughter. And there was the financial settlement, not a fortune by any measure, but enough to change the trajectory of their lives. "What do I do with this?" Jennifer asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You get your life back," said simply. "You pay off debts, you secure housing, you ensure that Sarah receives the best therapeutic care available, you build a foundation for your future." 3 days later, Sarah was released from foster care and returned to her mother's custody. The reunion, which occurred in the courthouse with Judge present, was captured by photographers and journalists. Jennifer held her daughter, and for the first time in months, Sarah's small body relaxed completely. She had her mother back. The bad man was gone. The scary place was ending. But the reunion was also bittersweet. In the months of separation, Sarah had changed. She was more withdrawn than before. She flinched at sudden movements. Loud noises caused her to startle. Nightmares plagued her sleep. The trauma of witnessing her mother's violence, combined with the trauma of forced separation, had left deep scars on a child's psyche. Jennifer immediately enrolled Sarah in therapy with a trauma specialist named Dr. Dr. specialized in treating very young children who had witnessed domestic violence. She used play therapy, art therapy, and animal-assisted therapy to help children process their experiences. "Sarah has experienced 2 distinct traumas," Dr. explained to Jennifer at their first consultation. "The first was witnessing violence. The second was the loss of you, the person she needed most at the moment she was most vulnerable. Recovery won't be linear, but with proper support, children are remarkably resilient." The news of Sarah's progress and of the broader implications of the case had captured national attention. Major news outlets ran segments on the role of police support animals in facilitating testimony from traumatized children. The story of a 3-year-old girl whose 2 words had changed everything spread across social media, news networks, and legal forums. But the attention wasn't just focused on the emotional narrative. It was also focused on systemic reform. Judge had been approached by state legislators and national organizations dedicated to improving domestic violence investigation procedures. He was asked to testify before committees. He was invited to speak at conferences. He became, unexpectedly, a voice for reform in how law enforcement approached domestic violence cases. The most significant outcome was the establishment of the County Police Support Dog Initiative. With initial funding of $2.3 million appropriated by the state legislature, the program would expand dramatically. Officer Tom Bradley was appointed as director of the initiative. Duke, now famous for his role in the Mitchell case, became the face of the program. Additional K-9 teams were trained. Protocols were developed for how support dogs could be incorporated into courtroom proceedings. Training was mandated for police officers, prosecutors, and judges on how to work effectively with trauma-informed support animals. Universities began incorporating cases like Sarah's into their curricula, teaching future lawyers, judges, and law enforcement professionals about the intersections of trauma, child development, and criminal justice. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was more personal. Ruth Holmes, the elderly foster mother who had cared for Sarah during those dark months of separation, became a permanent fixture in their lives. Jennifer insisted on hearing Ruth as Sarah's nanny, then later as a caregiver and family friend. The woman who had stepped in during crisis remained, a symbol of the kindness that had sustained them through the worst. Jennifer used the settlement money strategically. She paid off her accumulated debt from the months of legal fees and lost wages. She purchased a small, modest house in a safe neighborhood. She planted a garden where Sarah could play. She hung artwork on the walls and filled the home with the warmth and security that she'd been unable to provide during the dark days with. She returned to work as a nurse, but with modifications to her schedule that allowed her to be present for Sarah's appointments, her therapy sessions, her gradual re-entry into normal childhood activities. Her employer, moved by her story and impressed by her resilience, offered her a promotion into a supervisory role that provided better pay and more flexible hours. 6 months after her release, Sarah had made remarkable progress. She was still cautious, still prone to moments of anxiety, but she was also laughing again. She was playing with toys. She was forming new friendships at preschool. Most remarkably, she had requested to meet with Duke again. Officer Tom Bradley arranged a special visit. Sarah, now 4 years old, sat in a park with Jennifer nearby, and Duke approached with his handler. The little girl's face lit up with recognition and joy. She reached out to pet the dog, and Duke, understanding the significance of this moment, remained perfectly still, allowing Sarah to touch him, to feel the connection that had once saved her ability to speak. "Duke is a hero," Jennifer whispered to her daughter. "Duke helped you tell everyone the truth." Sarah nodded solemnly, her small hands buried in Duke's fur. In her child's way, she understood that this dog had changed everything. He had given her a pathway to safety. He had given her mother freedom. He had given their family a second chance. Judge received an invitation to a celebration event honoring the 1-year anniversary of Sarah's testimony. He attended, along with Detective Maria Santos, Officer Tom Bradley, and scores of others whose lives had been touched by the case's outcome. Sarah, dressed in a pink dress similar to the one she'd worn in court, presented Judge with a drawing she'd made, a picture of a dog wearing a judge's robe, standing next to a little girl. "This is Duke the hero, Judge," Sarah said shyly, handing over the artwork. Judge accepted it with tears in his eyes. He would hang it in his chambers, a daily reminder of why he'd fought so hard, why he'd challenged convention, why he'd believed that sometimes the system could be forced to do the right thing. The Mitchell case had become more than a local story. It had become a movement. Across the country, police departments began implementing support dog programs. Courts began how they approached testimony from traumatized children. Legislators began passing new laws designed to improve domestic violence investigations. All of it traced back to one moment in a Cleveland courtroom, when a 3-year-old girl found her voice, and a trained police dog made that possible. Jennifer and Sarah had their lives back. They had their freedom. They had their future. And they carried with them always the memory of the moment when everything changed, when darkness gave way to light, when injustice was overturned, when love proved stronger than violence. 1 year had passed since that courtroom moment when Sarah pointed at Duke and changed everything. The little girl who had been broken was now 5 years old, her strawberry curls longer now, bouncing as she ran through the sunshine on a Saturday afternoon. She moved with the unself-conscious joy of a child who had learned that the world, while sometimes scary, was more often filled with beauty and love. Jennifer Mitchell stood on the porch of their small house, watching her daughter play in the backyard. The house was modest, nothing fancy, nothing pretentious, but it was theirs. The walls were painted in warm colors. The kitchen had been renovated with funds from the settlement. And the backyard, once barren concrete, now held a garden where Sarah helped plant flowers and vegetables, learning about growth and nurturing and the simple miracle of seeds becoming something beautiful. Jennifer herself had transformed in ways that went far deeper than physical appearance, though that had changed too. The haunted expression that had defined her face during those dark months of custody battles and incarceration had been replaced by something approaching serenity. She had found employment as a clinical supervisor at the hospital where she'd worked before, overseeing a team of nurses and helping to train new staff in compassionate patient care. The irony wasn't lost on her. A woman who had been failed by every system designed to help her now worked within systems, trying to improve them from the inside. She had become, almost without meaning to, an advocate for change. She spoke to nursing students about trauma and resilience. She consulted with hospital administration on how to better support victims of domestic violence who came through their emergency rooms. But on this Saturday afternoon, she wasn't thinking about work. She was thinking about the invitation that had arrived in the mail 3 days earlier. The county animal shelter had asked if Sarah and Jennifer would like to volunteer together. They wanted to involve the community, particularly families, in caring for animals in need. When Sarah had opened the letter and seen the picture of dogs and cats on the front, her eyes had widened with excitement. "Can we, Mommy?" she'd asked. "Can we help the animals?" Jennifer had said yes before fully thinking through all the implications. Returning to a place where animals lived, where she'd have to confront the memories of that courtroom, where she'd have to face public recognition, all of that would require courage. But as she looked at her daughter's eager face, she realized that her daughter had already done the hardest thing imaginable. If Sarah could face her trauma and testify, certainly Jennifer could volunteer at an animal shelter. The following Saturday, they arrived at the county animal shelter. The facility was warm and welcoming, filled with the sounds of animals and the activity of volunteers working to care for them. Sarah clung to her mother's hand as they walked through, eyes wide with wonder and slight anxiety. Then they turned a corner and they both stopped. Officer Tom Bradley was there, and with him was Duke. Sarah's face transformed. The slight anxiety vanished, replaced by pure joy. "Duke," she called out, running forward before Jennifer could stop her. Tom had anticipated this. He'd coordinated with the shelter specifically to ensure Duke would be present for their first volunteering session. The dog, now 5 years old and showing slight gray around his muzzle, seemed to recognize Sarah immediately. He approached with his characteristic calm grace and allowed the little girl to throw her arms around his neck. "I wanted to surprise you both," Tom said to Jennifer, who had tears streaming down her face. "Duke still works, but he's also part of our community outreach program now. We bring him to shelters, schools, and hospitals. I thought you might want to volunteer together, you, Sarah, and maybe even Duke once a month or so." "We'd love that," Jennifer said, her voice thick with emotion. Over the next few hours, Jennifer and Sarah cleaned kennels, filled water bowls, and helped with basic shelter maintenance. Sarah was especially delicate with the animals, treating each one with the kind of gentleness that came from understanding vulnerability and fear. A frightened kitten in a cage seemed to respond to her small hands, coming forward to be petted. An older dog with anxiety issues relaxed in her presence. "She has a gift," the shelter director, a woman named, observed to Jennifer. "She understands what it's like to be scared." "Yes," Jennifer agreed quietly, "she does." As the afternoon wore on, Jennifer found herself in conversation with other volunteers, women who had their own stories of struggle and resilience. One had survived cancer, another had lost a child, a third had fled an abusive relationship. Each had found her way to the animal shelter as a place of healing, where helping creatures in need helped them find meaning in their own pain. By the time they left, Sarah was exhausted in the way that only happy exhaustion felt, the kind that came from engagement and purpose. In the car on the way home, she fell asleep, her head tilted against the window. Jennifer drove carefully, mindfully aware of the journey they'd taken. She thought about the apartment on Maple Street where everything had fallen apart. She thought about the jail cells where she'd spent countless nights wondering if she'd ever see her daughter again. She thought about Sarah in the foster home, withdrawn and traumatized, unable to speak. And then she thought about this moment, her daughter falling asleep after a day spent helping animals, safe, loved, healing. The transformation hadn't been instantaneous or complete. Sarah still had nightmares occasionally. She still startled at sudden loud noises. She would probably carry some scars from her experiences for the rest of her life. But she was also thriving in ways that mattered. She had friends at preschool. She loved school. She was developmentally on track. She was, most importantly, a child again, not weighed down by adult problems and violence. At home, Jennifer carried her sleeping daughter upstairs and tucked her into bed. She kissed her forehead and stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply watching her sleep. This child had saved her mother. This child had changed the system. This child, with two simple words spoken to a dog in a courtroom, had altered the trajectory of multiple lives. The following Tuesday, Jennifer received a call from Judge's office. The judge wanted to meet with her and Sarah to discuss something. When they arrived at his chambers, they found not just the judge, but also Detective Maria Santos, Officer Tom Bradley, and several other people who had been instrumental in their case. "I wanted to share something with you," Judge said to Jennifer. "The Mitchell case has been added to the Ohio State Bar Association's curriculum. Law students across the state will be studying your case, learning about domestic violence investigations, trauma-informed procedures, and the importance of questioning assumptions." He turned to Sarah. "And you, young lady, are the reason all of this is happening. You found your voice. You were brave. And because you were brave, other children will be helped." Sarah, still shy in formal settings, buried her face in her mother's shoulder. But Jennifer understood the magnitude of what the judge was saying. Their story, their pain, their struggle, their ultimate vindication, had become a teaching tool. It would help shape the next generation of legal professionals. That night, after Sarah was asleep, Jennifer sat on the porch under the stars and allowed herself to cry, not tears of sadness, but tears of gratitude. She thought about everything they'd lost and everything they'd gained. She thought about the broken system that had almost destroyed them and the individuals within that system who had fought to make it right. She thought about a little girl who had pointed at a dog and said two words that changed everything. And she thought about the future, a future that was no longer defined by fear, by violence, by injustice. A future where her daughter would grow up knowing that she had the power to speak truth. A future where they would build lives full of meaning, purpose, and love. The darkness had been real. The trauma had been genuine. The injustice had nearly destroyed them both, but they had survived. They had healed. And in doing so, they had created something that would help countless others. Out in the darkness, the stars shone with quiet constancy, indifferent to human suffering but also unmoved by human triumph. Life continued as it always did, and in continuing, in moving forward, in choosing hope over despair, Jennifer and Sarah had discovered something precious: the power of resilience, the strength of love, and the possibility of transformation. This was their new beginning, and it was beautiful. The end.